August 12th, 1704. The Danube Basin. The thunder was not from the sky, but from the earth. 1,000 hooves pounding the drought-hardened plain, a sound that vibrated up through the soles of her boots and into the marrow of her bones. A rolling, merciless promise of iron and fire. Anya Kovacs heard the warning bell clanging from the church tower and the distant, shredded screams of her neighbors. But her hands kept working, smoothing the wet clay of a new ditch bank with a tenderness one might reserve for a child's fevered brow. Her fingers tracing the final, crucial curve that would complete the circuit. The villagers had spat at her feet for turning good field into swamp, for wasting her inheritance on foolish, a maze-like canals that drowned the wheat and brought only mosquitoes, and the mocking title they gave her, the Ditch Witch, a name she wore now like a scar. Now those same villagers ran like rabbits toward the stone church, their shadows long and frantic in the late afternoon sun, while she stood alone in the center of her creation. A woman in a faded blue dress, surrounded by a glistening network of water-filled trenches that caught the bloody light and held it. She looked at her labyrinth, at the water she had secretly, painstakingly diverted from the stream all through the spring floods and the summer's brutal heat. A silver thread stolen and multiplied into a dozen branching veins. And she felt not fear, but a cold and furious clarity. They had taken her husband to their wars and returned only a rusted button, and they had taken her standing with their gossip and their scorn, and they would take her land over her dead body. But first, they would have to reach her. The drumbeat of the cavalry grew, a wave of dust rising on the horizon like a brown tide. And she could see the glint of lance tips now, the dark shapes of men and beasts becoming distinct. A wall of organized violence moving with terrifying speed across the open ground where the barley should have stood golden and tall. Let their horses come, she thought, her hands finally still, coated in gray mud that was the exact color of the sky before a winter storm. Let their proud captain in his polished breastplate lead his magnificent charge. Let the ground shake with their arrogant power, and let them meet my other crop, the one that grew not from seed, but from solitude, not from hope, but from grim necessity. She took one step back from the ditch edge, her heart a steady counter-rhythm to the oncoming storm, and she whispered the single, sodden word that was both her curse and her only prayer. Mud. She had been born to mud, though no one in the valley remembered that part of the story anymore. They only remembered the woman she had become, the one who chose it. Her first memory was not of her mother's face, but of the cool, black slick of it on her infant hands as she sat by the riverbank while her father mended his nets, a substance that yielded and held all at once. She learned its language young, how it whispered of water deep underground, how a certain shade of brown meant clay that would seal a pond, how a gray streak meant sand that would drink a channel dry. While other girls were taught to stitch and churn, her unofficial, uncelebrated education came from following the seasonal weep of springs along the hillside and tracing the way a sudden rain could cut a brand new gully overnight, reshaping the world in an hour. They called her father shiftless for his fishing, and they called her wild for her wandering. Two labels that stuck like the very mud on her boots. And by the time the fever took both her parents in the same terrible week when she was 16, the community's judgment was already set. A drier, more rigid kind of earth that would not be moved. She buried them herself on the rocky knoll, her hands blistered from the shovel, and then she stood alone on the 5 scrubby acres that were her inheritance. A debt of scorn already attached to the deed. Listening to the distant laughter from the harvest festival she was not invited to. That was the day she stopped trying to scrape the earth from her skin, the day she let it settle into the lines of her palms and the hem of her skirt as a permanent witness. The mud was her first and only true confidant, and in the years of solitude that followed, through the brief, bright respite of a marriage to a kind-eyed carter who saw the cleverness in her and was taken from her by a conscription notice, she spoke to it constantly, asking it questions about flow and resistance and hidden strength. The work began not with a grand declaration, but with the quiet, patient turning of a single spadeful of earth at the lowest corner of her property, a place where the spring runoff always pooled into a sour, mosquito-ridden bog. She did not dig a trench so much as she convinced the land to open a vein, following a subtle dip in the terrain that her bare feet had memorized over 1,000 solitary walks. And she guided that first trickle of released water not toward her garden, but in a slow, deliberate arc that traced what would become the outermost boundary of her world. It was a whisper of intent, not a shout. And she worked only in the hour before dawn and the long indigo twilight, times when the mocking eyes of the valley were turned inward toward their hearths, leaving her alone with the crickets and the settling dew and the satisfying, wet sound of iron biting into damp soil. She moved with the methodical rhythm of a heartbeat, her back bending and straightening in a silent liturgy. And the network grew, not as a planned grid, but as a living root system. At each new channel suggested by the land itself, a seam of softer clay here, a collection of flat stones perfect for a sluice gate there, the persistent dampness around a cluster of willow shoots that told of a hidden spring. She became a student of gradient and silt, of how to weave a course so it appeared a natural wash to the casual glance, yet held a calculated, deceptive depth beneath a fringe of transplanted cattails and watercress. And her tools were an extension of her will. The worn wooden handle of the spade, polished smooth by her grip, the iron bucket for hauling stone, the sharpened stick she used to probe the bottom for weakness. The money from selling her late husband's cart and mule bought her a few precious lengths of cast iron pipe from a traveling tinker, which she buried beneath what would look like a simple farm track. And this secret siphon became the crucial artery, stealing water from the creek on the far side of the ridge and delivering it, silent and unseen, to the high holding pond she'd carved into the hillside. A reservoir watched over by a single, gnarled hawthorn tree. While her hands were shaping water, the world beyond her muddy borders was shaping itself for violence. Rumors, at first as faint and distant as summer thunder, began to condense into hard, cold fact. The Lord's dispute over tariffs and timber rights with the neighboring barony had curdled into open threat, and his answer was not diplomacy, but the mustering of men and the sharpening of steel. From her high ground, she would sometimes pause, leaning on her spade, and watch the dust plumes rise from the military road that skirted the valley, a tan smear against the green that grew more frequent with each passing week. Then came the scouts, lean men on restless horses who appeared like ghosts at the edge of the tree line, their eyes scanning the land not for its beauty, but for its utility, for straight lines of advance, for fields flat enough to canter across, for farmsteads that could be burned for a message. They looked right through her, a lone woman ankle-deep in muck, her hair tied back with a strip of burlap, her figure obscured by a mud-caked smock. And they saw nothing of consequence, just another peasant too stupid to flee the coming storm. She watched them back, her gaze as still and measuring as the heron in her reeds, and she noted the arrogance in the set of their shoulders, the way they pointed and laughed at the crude scarecrow she'd placed in the middle of her most important, disguised diversion channel. Their dismissal was her camouflage, more effective than any cloak of leaves, and it allowed her work to continue, the network deepening and widening, becoming not just a means to water a field, but a language written in mud and flow, a sentence the land was learning to speak. The final confirmation of the threat arrived not with a trumpet, but with the grim, everyday reality of conscription. The Lord's men came to the valley, moving from door to door with a parchment list, taking sons and brothers and husbands to fill the ranks of the infantry. They bypassed her gate entirely, of course. For what use was a widow known as the ditch witch to a marching column? But they took the sons of the very men who had laughed at her father. And they took the strong-backed boy who had once thrown clods of earth at her when she passed. And they left behind a silence thicker than fog, a silence punctuated only by the weeping of women that carried on the evening wind. It was in this new, fearful quiet that the nature of the military traffic changed. The dust plumes grew larger, and the occasional scout was replaced by whole troops of cavalry riding along the valley road, their harnesses jingling, their banners snapping in the breeze, conducting exercises that churned the common pasture into a quagmire. She could hear their officers barking orders, crisp and contemptuous. And she saw how they looked at her valley, at the gentle slope of her own land leading up to the ridge, as if it were already theirs, a convenient ramp for a future charge. Their arrogance was a tangible thing, a heat haze of assumed superiority. And it was in that moment, watching a young lieutenant gesture broadly toward her fields with his riding crop, that her purpose crystallized from a vague instinct of defense into a cold, precise plan. The water was not just for irrigation anymore. It was for negation. Her canals would not fight the cavalry. They would simply persuade the ground beneath their hooves to cease being ground, to become something else entirely. A liquid trap, a sucking, bottomless betrayal. The morning they came was deceptively beautiful. Onto the sky a pale, washed-out blue, and the air holding the last cool breath of night. And she was at the far western sluice gate, her hands gritty with clay as she made a final adjustment to the wooden baffle, when a peculiar quality of silence made her look up. The birds had stopped singing. It was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a held breath. And then she heard it. A low, rhythmic shudder. A sound felt in the chest before it was heard by the ears, a tectonic grumble that made the water in the canal beside her shiver. She turned slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes scanning the southern ridge where the road crested, and there she saw the stain. A line of brown dust, rising like a smudge of judgment against the horizon. And beneath it, a dark, seething line that resolved as her heart climbed into her throat, into individual shapes. The glint of lance tips, the solid blocks of mounted men, the occasional flash of a standard. They were not passing through. They were forming up. The column halted at the ridge's crest, a silent, ominous parade. And she watched, her mouth dry, as a single rider detached and walked his horse forward to the very edge, surveying the valley spread below like a map. Her farm a mere speck in the center of the gentle, inviting slope. He raised an arm, and the line of dust began to move again, not down the road, but spreading out along the ridge, a flanking maneuver. And she knew with a cold, absolute certainty that the charge would come straight down the fallow field. The most direct route to the village heart, a route that ran directly through and across every one of her carefully sculpted waterways. The time for planning was over. The ditch witch was now a general, and her army was made of mud and gravity. The true genius of her design, the revelation that would turn mockery into awe, was not in the ditches themselves, but in the hidden geometry of the land between them, a geometry she now watched the cavalry commit to with terrifying speed. The charge began not as a headlong rush, but as a deliberate, widening front, not a hammer of men and horseflesh meant to overwhelm anything in its path by sheer, rolling mass. And they took the slope of the fallow field at a canter, building momentum, their formation tight and professional, What they saw, what any raider would see, was a series of shallow, grassy depressions. Mere farmyard inconveniences, perhaps 3 feet wide and just as deep, filled with what looked like stagnant, weedy water, obstacles so insignificant that a good horse could leap them without breaking stride. And so the commander, seeing this pathetic web of minor trenches, did not order a halt or a shift, but instead signaled for the charge to solidify and accelerate, to trample this nonsense into the mud from which it came. The first line hit the initial receiving canal at full gallop, and the deception was perfect. For the far bank was not a sharp lip of earth, but a long, engineered slope of sodden, reinforced clay, greased by the very water it held. And the horses' forelegs sank into what they expected to be firm ground, only to find no purchase at all. Their powerful chests slamming into the opposite slope, which crumbled under the impact, not into a solid wall, but into a slurry of liquid earth. The ditch did not stop them. It swallowed them. And the beautiful, terrible physics of her design unfolded, because that first canal was not a barrier. It was a collector. And as the first rank of horses and riders plunged into the muck, the second rank, unable to stop, piled into them from behind, and the third rank into the second, a catastrophic compression of force and fear. But the horror for the cavalry had only begun, because the water in that ditch was not stagnant. It was moving with a slow, syrupy pull, fed by a hidden culvert from the spring-fed reservoir upslope, and its current, gentle as it was, began to drag the tangled, screaming mass of men and animals sideways. Not downstream, but along a lateral channel that ran perpendicular to their charge. This was the second part of the geometry. The ditches were not a grid, but a funnel. And the struggling mass in the first canal was now being flushed, with dreadful inevitability, into the wider, deeper secondary channel she called the mill run, which had a steeper grade. The charge, in a matter of heartbeats, had been transformed from a horizontal assault into a vertical, drowning chaos, as the weight of armored men and panicked horses anchored them in the deepening mud, and the steady, insistent flow of water, which seemed so laughably trivial from the ridge, now became an inescapable, cold force, filling cloaks and dragging at limbs. From her vantage, she watched the magnificent charge disintegrate into a series of isolated, struggling pockets, the neat lines shattered by the topography itself, as horses trying to scramble out found the banks deliberately undercut and collapsing, and riders who abandoned their mounts sank to their waists in deceptively soft ground between the canals. Ground she had painstakingly honeycombed with shallow, peat-filled sponges that looked solid but would not hold a man's weight under panic. The cavalry was not being fought. It was being processed, and each element of her system working in silent concert. The receiving canals to break the formation and capture its momentum, the lateral flows to disaggregate and redirect the captured force, and the saturated, unstable fields between to prevent any rally or reformation. The sound of battle was not the ring of steel, but the sucking gasp of mud, the shrill terror of horses, and the shouts of men who were not wounded by weapons, but imprisoned by the very earth they had come to conquer. And as the rear ranks, seeing the fate of the van, frantically wheeled and scattered, seeking firmer ground, they found themselves channeled by subtle berms and hedgerows, planted not for crops, but for deflection, toward the final, elegant cruelty of the system. The old oxbow wetland she had restored and deepened, a placid, reed-choked pond that now served as a sump for the entire network, where the mud-slicked, exhausted, and disoriented could be contained, unharmed but utterly neutralized, up to their necks in cold water and humiliation. The charge had not been stopped by a wall. but dissolved by a watershed, its martial energy transformed into helpless thrashing. And the field, which had seemed so passive and vulnerable, was revealed as an active, intelligent adversary, a terrain that fought back by invitation, on turning the attackers' greatest strength, their weight, their speed, their massed power, into the very engine of their own defeat. She had not built a fortress. She had composed a sentence in the language of hydrology and soil, and the cavalry, in its arrogance, had marched in and become the punctuation. The ground did not tremble at first. It hummed, a low, resonant frequency felt in the teeth and the hollow of the chest, a vibration rising from the deep earth, as if the bedrock itself were tuning a dreadful instrument. Then came the drumming, not of individual hooves, but a single, rolling thunderclap that fractured into 1,000 simultaneous cracks, the sound advancing faster than sight could track, a wall of noise that swallowed the dawn bird song and the rustle of the barley in one gulp. Dust plumed on the horizon, a tawny, churning cloud lit from within by the glint of lance tips and polished helms, and the air grew thick with the smell of hot horse flesh, oiled leather, and the iron tang of collective intent. She stood at the small observation notch in the root cellar's wall, her hand flat against the cool stone, and watched the line of them coalesce from a shimmer into a solid, terrible fact. 100 riders, maybe more, moving as one rippling muscle. The morning sun catching their pennants so they seemed to be charging under banners of fire. The plan, the months of aching labor, the network of trenches and weirs and gates. All of it was theory until this moment. And the theory was now a screaming mass of muscle and momentum, descending the gentle slope toward her land at a speed that made the mind rebel, that turned the intricate geometry of her canals into childish scratches in the dirt. There was no more time for doubt, no space for the fear that coiled cold in her gut. Only the sequence, the practiced, calm sequence she had rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. As the first rank hit the marker stone at the property's edge, their shouts now audible, raw, and eager. She took one final, steadying breath that tasted of dust and impending storm. And she committed, her hand moving to the primary sluice gate's release lever, a simple oak spar that now held back the destiny of everything she had built and everything she was. The lever gave way with a deep, wooden groan that was lost instantly beneath the thunder of hooves. And for a heartbeat, nothing happened. A suspended, breathless moment where the world seemed to hold its judgment. Then the sound came, a low guttural roar that was not of beasts or men, but of the earth itself being torn open, as the pent-up water from the main cistern exploded into the primary feeder canal with the force of a loosed giant. A wall of silt-thick water that raced down the carved channel like a brown serpent uncoiling. The cavalry, committed to their full, devastating charge, saw only the flat, open field ahead, the prize of the homestead and its stores, and they leaned into their saddles, their lances lowering into a single, glittering line of promised ruin. The first rank hit the disguised irrigation channel that cut across the field's approach, not as a mere trench, but as a trap now suddenly flooded, the water transforming the carefully sculpted banks into instant, bottomless slurry. The leading horses plunged in, their forelegs snapping with sounds like green branches breaking in a storm. And the magnificent momentum of the charge converted in an eye blink into a cataclysm of falling bodies, screaming animals, and flying mud. Riders behind, unable to stop, piled into the wreckage. Their own mounts stumbling over the fallen, the orderly line collapsing into a churning, chaotic maelstrom of steel and flesh and liquid earth. She watched, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest, as the second and third sequences of her design activated almost of their own accord. The diverted channels, triggered by the rising water in the first, began to spill over their strategic banks, not with flooding violence, but with a deliberate, spreading creep that turned the entire killing field into a widening bog, a sucking, grasping mire that neutralized the greatest advantage of the cavalry: their speed, their terrible, unified weight. Individual riders, maddened by panic, tried to wheel their mounts around only to find new, smaller feeder ditches undermining their footing, the ground giving way beneath iron-shod hooves with a soft, treacherous sigh.